Well, thank you all for being here. Thanks for coming. I'm very touched that each of you took the afternoon to, and some of you are from out of state and from distances. It just really touches my heart. Thank you. So Michael was talking about when he was down at my house in Ashland last year, and we were going to do that black and white show, and I had 2 color prints up. I put them up on purpose just so he'd have to look at them. And he looked at them and turned to me and said, "You want a color show next summer?" And at first I said, "With what?" I said, "I just switched to color. These are the only color pictures I have." "Oh, don't worry about it, So I spent the last year working very hard, to put it mildly, because the main reason I agreed to the show, actually, I shouldn't say the main reason, but one of them was because I needed the kick in the butt to really make me focus on this work during the next year by having a deadline. And so every photograph in the room, except for one, were done during the past year. Which is kind of funny because the show last year was called Recent Work, and it was 21 years of work. So this is like really recent work, So anyway, it's good to be back in Astoria, and I thought I'd start off by just giving a short biography of how I got into photography and how it happened that eventually I came to photograph petroglyphs. I bought a camera first in 1966 when I was in the Navy in Japan, and it just took over my life. It was like I let some little silver and black devil into my life, and it just took over. And since then, I've just been a photographer. My only interest in it is really doing the work that I feel inside that I need to do. And but my first year and a half in photography was overseas on ships. I never knew that there was a field of art photography then. So since I was in a completely kind of isolated environment, I had that first year and a half to work with photography intensively with no input and no influence. And I feel that was very valuable for me because I really found my own way at the beginning and established my, my ways of seeing things and so on, and the aspects of technique that I look for in pictures and all that. So I get back to the United States, and it was another year before I found out there was an art of photography. And I was kind of blown away because I felt like I was being an artist in photography, but I didn't know if anybody else did it. And so I sort of started in a vacuum. And that really helped me to find my own way at the beginning, not through somebody else's work or approach, but directly from me. So in the 52 years now I've been doing photography, I've never taken a workshop or studied it formally. I've always picked up whatever I needed to know. Any questions at this point or comments?
What kind of cameras have you had?
Pardon me?
What kind of cameras have you had?
In 1971, I got what's called a Sinar Norma view camera, 4x5 inch, and I've used it up until last year. Yeah. And I used the same camera there for 71 until last year. They don't make things to last. So I was never one of these people who switches equipment and that sort of thing, But my work came to focus on landscape in the very early 70s. And I found that I liked to be out in the landscape alone to photograph primarily. It wasn't like a social activity for me, where I like to go out with groups or clubs and that sort of thing. So my way of working is really going off for about 2 weeks at a time into the wilderness in my four-wheel drive van and being at a place for those 2 weeks. And we have two of those locations in this show. The ones that are called Casa Diablo are in Eastern California, and the ones that are called Lone Grave Butte are in Southeast Oregon. They're from two different concentrations of petroglyphs. But in both cases, I go out there and camp for a couple of weeks and photograph all through the day. I get up in the morning and have breakfast, put on my sunscreen and stuff. Off I go, and for 7-8 hours each day of work. And lately, I've really concentrated on staying in one place because it's so tempting to think, oh, maybe I should go over here, nothing happening here, you know. But just stay there with it. And I'm finding that incredibly rewarding, that degree of concentration, because, you know, we all tend to get bored with if there's no stimulation from a place. And if I'm out there, say at this archaeological site, there's nobody around. I often don't see a person for those whole 2 weeks. And you just drop through it and stay and keep working. And as I say, I found that extremely rewarding. There's also kind of rewards that aren't exactly photographic. For instance, all the animals get used to me after a few days, and they don't bother with me. They just go about their tasks, you know, all the bunny rabbits and lizards and everything, and stop being scared. And I just love that. It's sort of like a return to the way the world should be, in my view. Any questions here? Comments?
Well, what do you find rewarding about staying in one place?
Because I can go deeper with it.
Is it the light? Changing the light changing, is that part of it?
The only light I'm really concerned with is the light in me. All light outside is perfect for photography. There are a lot of myths about, you know, oh, you got to photograph early in the morning or late in the afternoon. I find all that to be useless because anywhere, at any moment, something astounding can happen right in front of you if you're paying attention. And it could pass in 2 seconds, that moment. And
so you're waiting for those moments?
if I do, that's a really good point. If I start waiting for them, then I tend to start becoming impatient. Oh, nothing, where is it? So I try to drop that and just simply be there with all senses alert and as aware as I can be, both inwardly and outwardly. And then if something happens photographically, that's nice. If it doesn't, that's nice too. It's very freeing.
So you're just present you stay present for whatever happens, is that right?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Can you give an example of something magical that happens while you're there?
Well, okay. The picture right over your head. The center section, that's a straight photograph. The center section of the mountains is not what is there if you want to see with the physical eyes.
Okay.
That.
Here?
Yeah, up the center. Yeah,
Here?
yeah. The mountains look very different than that. So that's a photograph in which it went to beyond the edge that I look for, to where it starts becoming an image of something else than the physicality.
Was it there all along?
No, I you know.
It was a special moment.
It was a special moment. I assume that whatever that is there all along, and we simply don't image it.
And it just happened and then it went away?
Yeah. But I've been there 2 weeks in basically deep meditation, because that's what the trips really are. And the camera is a nice excuse. It gives me something to do. And, you know, and sometimes the pictures are nice and sometimes they're not. It doesn't really matter.
Do you find yourself going through a process of disentangling yourself from the world of people and society and the urban world, and in order to become more caught up in the natural world and a different energy?
Yeah, it's pretty well how I live my whole life. Nowadays, it's almost monk-like.
Because, you know, John Muir and other people have said similar things about, you know, disengaging from one world and
Yeah, I've really disengaged a lot from the culture in the last 20 years. I haven't seen a movie for 10 years or so. I, you know, only skim the news just so I can know if I'm, you know, going to be safe tomorrow. And don't watch television, anything like that. I've really pretty well cut it off. Can't do it entirely, you know. But,
so you have a double life, huh?
Absolutely, yeah. So all of these photographs, except one, are of petroglyphs. You guys know what petroglyphs are? They're images made by First Nation people on rocks, either by pecking, grinding, and that sort of thing. The other kind of native or First Nation rock art is pictographs, which were painted with mineral pigments. And there's one pictograph image down there by the video camera. All the rest are petroglyphs. The pictograph images don't last that long, particularly if they're in the sun. There probably was a lot more paint out there a few centuries ago, I think. But they fade away, so it's kind of special to find a panel in that pristine condition with really good clear colors. And it's kind of a rare panel because it's multicolored. So they had different yellow and red pigments and black, and they'd mix them with animal fat or something for a binder and make a paste, and then you could paint. And they'd use that for body paint, I believe, and for I don't know, painting their outfits and painting on rocks and so on. Then we have the petroglyphs, and they last a very long time. There's some over in southeastern Oregon that they're called the carved abstract style, and it's kind of apparent some of them go back before anybody admits there were people on this continent, which is about, that horizon's at about 14,000 years now, as I understand. But I was talking to the BLM archaeologist from Lake County in southern Oregon, and he wouldn't say anything definite because he's a scientist, but it was obvious he also believes there were people on the continent before the last ice age, not afterwards, which is, you know, what we grew up with. At the Cordilleran ice sheet melted and people came over on a land bridge to Alaska from Russia and came down. Well, they did come that way, but apparently there were people here before all that ice happened. And even when the ice sheet covered Canada, there was a break in it over near the west coast coming down from Alaska. And you could come down through that right into eastern Washington and eastern Oregon and down into California. Well, kind of interesting that in eastern Oregon we have this extremely ancient rock art. And also it goes down into Nevada. They actually managed to date a site at Winnemucca Lake near Reno that's right in that line coming down at over 11,000 years ago. And the way they were able to date the petroglyphs was they're next to a big lake, Winnemucca Lake, and they know the levels of the lake all through history. Has been studied. And there was only one opportunity to make those petroglyphs, where the lake dropped down and went back up, like within 1,000 years. And so there's your date. Unless they were divers, holding their breath, pecking at petroglyphs. But, I often get asked, what do petroglyphs mean? Well, that's a good question, because the tragedy is we don't know very much about that. And particularly in the Great Basin where I photograph, which is almost the whole state of Nevada, plus bits of the surrounding states around Nevada. When the 49ers came through Nevada, which had been pretty much spared in terms of the native population up till then, who wanted to go out in that hot desert, it just wiped out the population of Nevada. In a few years, the wagon trains coming through, for instance, would often have herds of cows, of 2,000 or 3,000 cows. And they would cut this swath, eating all the vegetation, trampling all the water holes and stuff. And then what's the native people that live off of that going to do? A lot of starvation, and so on. But the population disappeared. So by the time in the 1890s, when early archaeologists got out there and all to interview them, there was hardly anybody left. And the survivors were too traumatized to want to talk to a white person. So we lost an awful lot of knowledge about the context and meaning of the petroglyphs. And archaeologists who specialize in rock art spend their lives trying to reconstruct those meanings and just discover what they are. From the ethnology, the interviews with Indians that do exist, and, just trying to figure it out. So there are a lot of theories floating around on various images in rock art and what they mean. But usually nobody really knows. And so we just live with mystery in it. But I believe they're incredibly precious and to be protected, because they're the only thing left of these ancient cultures that lived here. Literally the only thing are the petroglyphs. All of the material culture that was wood and skins and made out of, plant-based fabrics and things all are long, long gone. At this point, any comments, questions?
Yes. This is fascinating. But could you tell me why you are personally interested in this subject?
I'd like to know. I would. I was going to, I knew I'd give this talk, and I felt like I should be able to say why I photograph petroglyphs. I can only tell you that they touch me deeply. I find them very moving, emotionally and spiritually. And that's why I do petroglyphs. I'd never even seen a petroglyph until 1999, even though I'd been out in the desert photographing all those years. I'd never ran into one. There's over 2,000 petroglyph sites in Nevada, but I never encountered a single petroglyph. And then one day on the way to a ghost town near the Pahranagat Valley in eastern Nevada, I looked over and saw my first petroglyph, and that was it. And it was like, boop, I'm a petroglyph photographer. And that was 1999. So I photographed petroglyphs in black and white for 18 years. And now I'm working with them, as you can see, in color. To just go with the flow is too passive. And you might say that's the inside of us. But we also have the yang side. We need the assertiveness and the decisiveness and so on as to complete the picture. Otherwise, it just gets too wishy-washy.
Just by taking your camera in a location is rowing the boat, right?
That's part of it, yeah.
Now, I find when I'm shooting out that when I'm focusing on subjects that I'm more aware of what's going on than if I'm not there with the camera, because you're focusing on certain things. But I hear people say, well, throw away the camera, you're not really experiencing what's here. What's your view on those two?
Oh yeah, throw the camera away. Keep somewhere in the back of your head its capabilities and what it's capable of, and then let it go. And because if I start trying to look for anything specific, it becomes a limitation and a trap. It can work for a little bit, but it has to be dropped. And you might say, you mentioned creativity, that is the doorway to creativity, because the not knowing what I'm looking for means there's the opportunity for something to present itself to me as significant that I've never seen before, that I never would have conceived. Even if it's how the picture's constructed, how it's composed. That's what I really look for. I don't try to repeat successes. I don't try not to repeat successes. So people often have commented over the decades on my black and white work that every picture seems so different. Well, that's why. I don't trap myself in my own style. I hope. And, sure. I don't know. Am I answering the questions?
I'm still not quite sure, because when I go up to the beach, often I'm taking my camera, and I am looking for interesting things.
Oh, sure.
Are you saying that's wrong?
No, I'm just saying that I think that if you're looking for them out of a model from the past, that you've seen pictures that were successful and that sort of thing. And even if you're not thinking of them consciously, they're like templates in you. And what you do is somehow in relationship to that. That's why I quit looking at people's portfolios years ago and so on. I didn't want to fill my head with other people's pictures anymore. They might be brilliant pictures, but I don't want them in my head. When I'm out there, I want the freedom of not having all these reactions to other pictures, because then they get into the process of what I'm doing. And you can say, well, you can learn from others and all. That's absolutely true. But I find that I've never wanted to do that. I've always followed my own way. And
so you keep an open mind.
Yeah.
Whatever presents itself.
Yeah, I have no idea if I'll make a so-called good picture, but I'm there totally in case it wants to happen, you might say.
So when it comes to like wildlife, you mentioned the bunnies and the lizards and so forth. Do you ever make an effort to focus on them, or are you staying with the petroglyphs?
Oh, I do a little snapshot of the bunnies and things now and then. I can't resist, they're too cute.
But your main focus is on petroglyphs.
Well, I would just do landscape too, but the petroglyphs 99% of the time are what draw me. And like I said, I really can't tell you why, except that they arouse feelings in me of profundity and also an enormous sadness for the fate of the native cultures on our continent. I had no idea about it until I started really reading up on the real history, So, a sub-agenda of my petroglyph photographies is just to, if you will, remind folks that there were people here before we arrived. In fact, this continent was at its carrying capacity as far as people were. There were as many people as the land could support in the United States. But, and this was at the time nobody's fault, but when the first settlers came here and they brought European diseases, and as I say, it wasn't their fault in any way at that time, of smallpox, measles, and all this that the population had no immunity to. It started disease epidemics that would start at the East Coast and slowly travel across the country. And it's estimated that 60 to 75% of the population die in those disease epidemics. And so when the United States began expanding west, the tribes, the groups and cultures out there were not in any condition to defend themselves. They were traumatized, could barely survive. If you had, think of 75% of the people in the United States got sick and died. How would everything work? You know, so the conquering of the West leaves out that fact of the diseases.
So would you say a portion of your interest is the empathy you have for these people?
Well, sure. It's hard to know why I do them. I mean, it's complicated for me. It's very complicated, and how to present these, because in a way, I want to show the petroglyphs, but in a way, I don't want you to go to these sites because every visitor degrades the sites, including me. I'm up on something called site etiquette, which is a sort of set of rules for visiting these sites. You never touch the rock art because skin oils, even on the stone, degrade the image over time. You don't walk on them. You don't pick up artifacts. You know, you treat the place really with respect. So the Bitter Ridge, Casa Diablo site that's represented in here is a National Register site. It's confidential, so I couldn't even tell you where it is if I was crazy enough to want to, because if I did, it'd be a crime, wouldn't it? Isn't it illegal to give out the location of the confidential ones?
I don't know. It depends on whether you. I don't really know whether it's done or not.
I believe it is, but anyway.
It probably shouldn't be done.
Yeah.
We'll wait for you outside after.
Do you put these online? Do you put these online?
I'm going to. There's going to soon be an update to my
You
website.
can strip them of the GPS? Because I know that in Asia, they're wiping out all the species by posting them on Facebook. People are stripping out the GPS and the poachers are going and getting stuff.
Happily, my camera doesn't record the GPS
Is
locations.
it Sony?
No. So I'm real pleased. Oh, well,
It's a Sony.
yeah, well, mine doesn't. And because I looked at that metadata on, and yeah, and it doesn't on mine, and I'm real pleased about that. Otherwise, I would remove it.
The A7R requires coupling to a GPS device like a cell phone. Otherwise, it doesn't have the capacity.
You think you'll be working with them for a while longer?
Probably. Probably.
Are there other photographers that are into this subject as well?
I know a few. There's one right there. Hey, Bob.
No, I'm not a photographer, John. You are.
Oh, you do fine.
I just take a picture of him.
Yeah,
Not that good.
I got it. This is Bob Claybaugh from Rachel, Nevada. Very good friend. Came all the way out here. I tell you a funny story. My view camera, I carried it in a wood box I made that was painted white, and I had backpack straps, and I carried it on my back. Well, we were out there in the Nevada desert walking along. Some guys were hiking and saw us and came over. And they're like, "What are you carrying on your back?" I said, "An air conditioner."
True story.
After that, it was the air conditioner. I wasn't a photographer anymore. You know, I did say I got to get my camera. It's the air conditioner, but that was really amusing, I thought. Bob still teases me about it. We just had an email exchange, and he's like, "Well, maybe I can keep up with you now if you're not carrying that air conditioner."
In this pictograph in the back here, is the orange colors on the wall, is that painted on, or is that the color of the rock? Do you know?
I think if that main figure is facing us, which I assume it is, to the left of it, I believe it's all paint. But around the top and all, and at the bottom, that's the natural rock color. There's something interesting in that picture that it interests me, because the field I study most is psychology, depth psychology. To the left of this figure, all the little figures are very fuzzy. To the right, they tend to be sharp. And I know another figure that's similar in eastern Nevada that's a petroglyph panel that's the same. Well, the left is the side, literally, of the unconscious, the side of dreaming. The right side, the left side of the brain, is the side of rationality and waking perception, and so on. So the imagery over on the left is dreamlike and soft, and the imagery on the right is of this world. And that's my own interpretation. But when I got to thinking of that panel in Nevada out there, and this one, it just made perfect sense. But that's what happens with rock art. We start looking at it and we start thinking, what is it about and all, and we come up with theories, you know. And I was talking to a rock art scientist last year at the Casa Diablo site. He showed up, and he was telling me that actually the Australian scientists are much more scientific than the American. American rock art scientists tend to want to interpret it. And there they just count it and stay in what science can do without speculation. So I'm trying more and more not to get my own ideas about it. But the one thing we do know is that they were very religious cultures. There was no separation between religion and daily life. The physical world was the spiritual world. They didn't have that duality. You could, in any spot, literally, you could also have a religious ceremony or something. It didn't have to be a special place, usually. So they didn't separate religion and the secular in the way we do as a duality. Which I find really interesting. Different way of being in the world.
How did your relationship or experience with the petroglyphs change when you switched to color?
Boy, getting some good questions. I don't think my fundamental relationship with them has changed at all. I just see that I can represent them now with another level of information in the pictures. In black and white, you have tone, you have shapes, you have the drawing of the picture and all. But adding color, each of those factors in black and white is information. But adding color adds another level of information that to me is more emotional. And so a big effort in the past year in printing this has been finding out what colors. what shades, what depth of tone and so on is appropriate for these, because what I'm looking for is to present them in the most beautiful way I can. That's the whole agenda. It's a matter of respect for these folks that lived out there, you know.
Is there one image in particular that nearly didn't happen, but all the elements came together at the right time in the right place that maybe is a good story?
Yeah, I would say the owls. You were asking about magic out there. Perhaps this touches that in a little way. I had been to that spot, and I made a photograph just to the right of those owls in black and white. And I thought it was quite wonderful, but I'm looking at the ground glass and I kept thinking, this is a wonderful picture, but something's missing. But I did it anyway. And I went home and I kept looking at the negative and I couldn't figure out what was missing. I felt like I needed to recompose it, but I didn't know how. So the next year I went back, the next summer, a year later, and I'm laying in my van one afternoon, all of a sudden I'm like, okay, it's time to go down there. And I went down to that spot, and I get in there, and there's that panel I'd photographed the year before that I failed with, and another petroglyph over here. Well, I decided to photograph that one first. So I'm photographing it, and I, view cameras, you're looking in the back of them. And I get this creepy feeling, somebody's looking at me. It's like, and it's dead silent. There's no sound whatsoever, but it's like, how can this be? How can I have this feeling? So I take my head out from behind the camera, look over, and about as far as Marion, there's two owls on the rock staring at me. Mama and her adolescent baby still in its baby pajamas, the gray one. And my hair stood on end. I just walked up, they weren't there. And I'm looking in the view camera, get that feeling, and they are. And even if they'd walked out of a crack in the rock, I should have heard them, because it was dead silence. They certainly didn't fly in, but they were there. And so I did a photograph with the view camera, and well, that completed the picture, didn't it? They were in the exact spot to make that picture come alive that I'd been wondering about the whole year. What can complete this photograph? And so I in those days, I carried a little digital camera on my belt just for things like this, and I did that picture of them. And it gets to be in the show because there's a row of dots across the bottom that are petroglyphs. So I was pleased with that because I wanted to put it in the show. But with the view camera and all, I was there about 40 minutes photographing. They never moved a muscle. Eyes just follow. Oh, that reminds me. Not too many stories, are there? Do you like stories?
Yeah.
I was at a public site in the Rodman Mountains near Barstow, California, called Inscription Canyon, one hot afternoon, and I working with the view camera, and back then I also had that feeling I was being observed. I look over, and there's a ledge of rock next to me, and 5 lizards are lined up. I could have touched them, and they're watching. So I'm kind of astounded. Lizards are pretty shy animals. So they're all, oh, look at that. So, I do stuff and their eyes would follow it. So I thought, these guys want to learn view camera photography. So I taught them how to use a view camera. I thought I'd probably the only person you'll meet that taught view camera photography to a bunch of lizards. But I just did it for fun. Explained what I was doing, and they watched the whole thing, so he probably went home and said, you won't believe this, but
John, I have a couple of questions. Look, years ago, 20-some years ago, I took a workshop with you, a black and white workshop, way back in the day. And I'm curious, when did you start using color? And then you're such a master black and white printer. Did you find there was a learning curve, a challenging learning curve using color? So how long have you been doing color? And tell us about how you mastered it, so to speak.
Oh, I'm a beginning student. I really am. I've been doing it a little over a year, haven't I? And full time, 7 days a week. If I'm not out in the field, and it's just been enormously challenging and rewarding.
Sure.
But learning to use those tools is, well, it's quite a learning curve. You know.
You've done a good job.
That's very kind of you, thank you. You know, I was actually kind of nervous because I didn't have any reference point. I don't look at other people's work anymore or anything, so I'm in this vacuum, and I honestly was doing the absolute best I could on these prints, but I didn't know how other people would find them. But to me, this is a beginning of something, and I hope it develops over the years and grows. Yes, sir.
John, this is just a nuts and bolts question. Are you still using film and still using your view camera, or have you changed all your equipment?
I've changed all my equipment. Very hard. It was easy in the sense that I knew it was the right thing to do, and very unsettling. You know, very unsettling. It's like a death. I had this whole part of me that was so invested in the black and white, and it had such a long career, that to have the non-attachment to just be able to put it aside when necessary was, kind of hard. And I'll probably miss it. And I'll probably, in digital, also do some black and white. There's a couple images that I think already I'm going to convert to black and white because I struggled with them for a couple of weeks in color and could get nowhere. And then I suddenly went, they're black and white pictures, you idiot. Take the color out.
What kind of subjects are you say you work 7 days a week, but you're not always in the locations to get petrographs. What other subjects do you do when you're not on location, these locations?
Oh, I'm working on the pictures on the computer and learning the processes and the software and all that stuff.
So your color photography is mostly digital based now?
It's all.
All, okay.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the equipment? What camera you're using?
Yes, I have a mirrorless camera. I came into the field, I didn't even know it was available. I don't follow photographic equipment at all. But I have, a Sony A7R II. It's a little kind of SLR camera, except it has you're looking at a screen in it, not through the lens. So it's much smaller than the SLRs and lighter. And 2 zoom lenses and a macro lens. And I must say it's a bit easier to carry than the air conditioner. That was 50 pounds, by the way.
Do you
I'm sorry.
use a tripod?
Oh yeah, I always work on a tripod. I find it helps me compose much more precisely. And I'm so used to it from the view camera, I just kept the tripod. I also am a sort of sharpness junkie. I want every last grain of sand to present itself clearly. And much to my surprise, I found out that with that 42.5 megapixel camera, I can actually do large prints that are much sharper than I could get with a 5x7 inch view camera. Higher resolution and smoother tones. So And Sony has come out with these new GM zoom lenses that in tests are much better than the Canons and Nikons. They've taken on those two old giants of the field, big time, which I'm glad to see. They ruled photography from before I got in the 60s. Nikon and Canon were the two top brands. But Sony must have a lot of cash to throw at R&D because they decided to, blow them out of the water.
So are you into digital from now on?
Yes. Yeah. I made that decision. I don't want to be split between two mediums. I don't want to be out there trying to make decisions. Should I use film? Should I use digital? And that sort of thing. It gets the mind too much into the process.
So the 7 days when you're working, on the computer, what are you doing on the computer with your photos?
Working on them in a software program like Photoshop Elements, lightening, burning and dodging and intensifying or desaturating colors, this sort of thing.
Okay.
And I found that one advantage of the computer and digital is that I can pay attention and modify any tiny point on the print, make it lighter, darker, make it go away, way beyond what I could do in the darkroom. If I was printing in the darkroom, say I'm printing a print of Descending Angel, some of you are familiar with that photograph from 1981. It might take 15 to 20 burning in and dodging actions. Adding more light to areas, shading areas during the exposure to make them lighter, this sort of thing. I could handle about 20. That's my limit. And I'd have this list by the enlarger written with a felt tip pen. And I'd have to do that because who in the heck can remember that? Okay, we burn in the upper left corner for 4 seconds and you move the card like this. And then this corner, 3 seconds. You move it like this so the light tapers right and so on. So about 20 was my limit. With digital, some of these have hundreds. And that means that's why it takes so much time. But it means there's the potential, if I'm up to it, for making better prints, in my view. Because I just wanted to say, because often in my black and white pictures, there'd be things I couldn't do anything about that I'd rather weren't there, but I couldn't remove them and that sort of thing. A good example is photographing petroglyphs. Many of the rocks, the surface of the rock is spalted off in a lot of places, and you have these very light areas all around the petroglyphs that are so distracting. In the darkroom, I could burn in big ones. Then I could spot out smaller ones when the print was dry with retouching dyes. Tedious job. But if that rock was really spalted all over, I just have to give up on it and let it go. But in digital, I can, clone in other parts of the rock to fill those spalts and stuff, and it looks completely natural if you do it well. And so that really opened up the petroglyph photography, and that I can do well with a bunch of petroglyphs that I couldn't before because the rocks were too messy.
Can you tell me, if you think of the photography going out in the fields being like production, I'm a filmmaker, you call that production. Then afterwards, you got the post-production afterwards, which is like you're doing in the lab or on computer. Would you say that they're both creative for you, equally creative, or do you enjoy both processes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the creative thing for you personally? What does that mean for you to be creative in your photography? Philosophically speaking.
For me, creativity is being able in a moment to invest the totality of myself in the moment without any resistance. To be there.
And you have to be alone to do that, right?
Yeah, I do. Because other people pull me back into the social or the consensual reality, let's say.
So what is it like to be in that state of mind? Do you feel a connection with something beyond yourself? Or are you connecting with something inside yourself?
Well, there's no real barrier between those.
Can you explain what that means?
These are good questions.
Do you find it difficult verbalizing a nonverbal state?
It's a complete I would call it a complete absence of conflict on all levels, internally and externally. There's no feeling, not thought like, oh, I should have gone over here, or any of that.
Absence of conflict?
Yeah, internally, or doubt. You just do it.